Hello everybody, my name is Alex Swan. This is the $0 MCAT course. Today we're going to be discussing the circulatory system, and we're going to talk about particularly the pulmonary and systemic circuits in humans. Let's get started. So before we get into the details of the circulatory system, let me just propose, if you will, a general question, and that is, why do humans and other multicellular organisms need a circulatory system? Of course, there are many correct answers, but one of the reasons that relates a lot to our discussion today is the fact that virtually all body cells, with some exceptions, perform aerobic respiration in order to survive, in order to obtain energy. And as you can see from this equation of aerobic respiration, which is not balanced, by the way, oxygen is required for respiration to occur. Now, where do we get oxygen for our bodies? Well, the air that we breathe contains lots of oxygen, right? And this oxygen-containing air, when we breathe it, it's first going to come into contact with cells in our lungs called alveolar. Goodness me, what's going on? I apologize for that. Once we inhale oxygen into our body, that oxygen is immediately going to come into contact with a group of cells in the lung called alveolar cells, right? And these are in the lung, and they actually form the alveoli, which are these air-filled sacs that are located at the end of bronchioles. Now, this oxygen comes into contact with alveolar cells in the lung, so these cells can survive, great. These cells have oxygen to perform respiration. But what about the other cells in our body? What about cells in our brain? What about cells in our skeletal muscle? What about cells in our digestive tract, etc.? These cells also need oxygen to survive, but they're nowhere near the lungs, so they're not going to get the oxygen that they need, right? Similarly, a waste product of aerobic respiration is CO2. CO2 is acidic, right? And the reason for that is because when CO2 gets placed into an aqueous solution, it combines with water to give you carbonic acid, which will dissociate into a proton and its conjugate base, right? And obviously, anything that will dissociate into a proton and a conjugate base is an acid, right? So CO2 isn't all that great for our bodies either, but how are we going to remove it? Right? So we have a conundrum here. How are we going to deliver oxygen to the cells that need it outside of the lungs? And how are we going to remove CO2, right, from the cells that are performing active respiration? Well, the answer lies in the circulatory system, right? And this next slide is going to hopefully illustrate that point. Now, this is a very general diagram of a circulatory system found in humans and other mammals, right? It's a closed circulatory system that consists of a 4-chambered heart and performs double circulation. We're going to go over what all that nomenclature means. But first, I want you to appreciate what's occurring here in this figure, right? Double circulation refers to the fact that the blood that is in the heart will move around through two circuits, right? First, this so-called pulmonary circuit, and then it's going to move around this so-called systemic circuit, right, before it returns back to the heart, right? So that's what double circulation means. What we can see from this figure is that when the blood moves to the lungs, right? The pulmonary circuit just concerns the lungs, right? The pulmonary circuit involves only the lungs, while the systemic circuit involves the organs and the rest of the body. What we can appreciate is that oxygen-poor blood, right, in blue here, when it leaves the heart, it's going to be oxygenated in the lungs, right? We can see oxygen entering that blood and CO2 is leaving. although we can't see that in terms of the colors of this because the colors only refer to oxygen, but that's also true, so that CO2 leaves, this acidic molecule leaves the blood, right? And then we have the blood coming for yet another circuit, right, the systemic circuit, which will deliver blood to the body cells and the organs outside of the lungs. And we can see that oxygen, right, is leaving this blood, which is important, right, because this oxygen, apologize, this is my first time using this system, because this oxygen, right, is required for respiration, right? And the CO2 is now entering this blood, which again is relevant because CO2 is a byproduct of respiration, right? And if it's not removed, it can result in very acidic conditions, which are not good for the body. So just this general picture allows us to appreciate the fact that the circulatory system enables us to obtain oxygen in our blood where it's available, meaning at the lungs, and remove oxygen from our blood where we need it, right? Namely in the systemic circuit, i.e. the rest of the entire body outside of the lungs. Now, while we're on this slide, let's just go over some of the nomenclature here. Right? We went over what double circulation means. The fact that this is a four-chambered heart should be obvious to you. We have two different types of chambers, right? We have an atrium. Sorry about that. We have an atrium right here, and we have a ventricle. The atrium is going to receive the blood from capillaries, right? Let's go over what a capillary means. A capillary pretty much describes the blood vessel types, a type of blood vessel that is going to engage in the exchange of oxygen, CO2, and various other substances, nutrients, and gases with the rest of the body, with cells in the body, right? So capillaries really describe where you have this exchange take place, right? Capillaries are located at sites of gas nutrient exchange. And of course, I could also add waste, right? Could squeeze that in. So back to the topic of a four-chambered heart, right? The atria of the heart, I should say, will receive blood from the capillaries, right? And the ventricles will distribute blood to the capillaries. Now we can see that we have a right and left heart, right and left sides of the heart. Each side has an atrium and a ventricle, so that makes for four total ventricles, right? Right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. And lastly, I want to discuss this concept of a closed circulatory system. Now, this is obviously something that is present in humans. We don't really need to know what an open circulatory system means since it's not relevant to humans and thus it won't be on the MCAT. But let me explain to you what this is getting at. A common misconception is that stuff, nutrients, gases, substances in the blood are directly exchanged between body cells. Right? This is false. What actually occurs, in fact, is we have some sort of a blood vessel here, right? Let's call it a capillary, right? So we have a capillary, and we're going to have blood in this blood vessel. I'm going to make sure that it's red. Then we're going to have these body cells, right? So let me draw these body cells, right? And these could be any types of cells, right? They could be, for example, the alveoli, the alveolar cells. They could be muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells, etc. Right? So we have these body cells with these large, nice nuclei. And in fact, we see that this blood here that is located in our capillaries, right? This blood actually stays within the capillaries, right? We have substances that diffuse in and out of the capillaries, but most of the blood actually stays within that capillary, and it's cycled throughout our bodies several, many times. Our blood, right? In contrast to what most people believe, our body cells are not directly bathed by the blood. The blood doesn't surround our body cells. What surrounds our body cells instead is this fluid, right? And this is what I'm shading here, right? This fluid is actually what bathes our body cells, right? And this fluid is going to be called interstitial fluid. So we have interstitial fluid that bathes our body cells, not the blood. And this is something unique of a closed circulatory system, right? The circulatory system is closed, and from that we can infer just, by what the word means that the blood, right, will remain within this closed circulatory system, so it can't exit this circulatory system. So nutrients and gases and substances are going to be exchanged between the blood and the interstitial fluid first. And the interstitial fluid is then going to exchange those nutrients and substances and what have you, right, between the body cells, right? So substances like oxygen, like CO2, right? For example, oxygen, right, is going to move. If this were let's say the systemic capillaries, right? Let's say these are the systemic capillaries. What's going to occur is that oxygen, right, is going to move from the blood to the interstitial fluid and then to the body cells, right? And that's something unique about a closed circulatory system, is that we have this blood and interstitial fluid that are both distinct from one another and do not intermix. All right. So now that we've kind of had that little interlude, let's focus a little bit more on the details behind this circulatory system. And let's first talk about even more nomenclature. So blood vessel is not a specific term. It can refer to any sort of vessel that connects the heart to the capillaries or vice versa. It's not a specific term. We're going to need to know some specific terms for the MCAT. And let me just go over these. So, blood in a closed circulatory system flows unidirectionally, right? So in humans, blood will flow from the ventricle to arteries, to arterioles, to capillaries, right? Remember, these capillaries, like I mentioned before, were the location of gas substance exchange, right? Then the blood is going to go from these capillaries to venules, to veins, and then it's going to return to the heart at the atrium chamber, right? That's one of the 4 chambers of the heart. There's a little bit more we need to know about these terms, right? So like I said, a ventricle is going to be what distributes blood to the capillaries of the body. So let's just focus a bit on this upper half of this diagram for now. So blood leaves the heart at the ventricle. It's then going to go into an artery, right? The blood from the arteries is going to go into arterioles. Now, I say that arteries branch into arterioles here, and if you're thinking what most people are thinking, that's you're correct, right? We have a big artery right here, for example, and this is going to branch into smaller individual, if I could draw it better I would, but this big artery is going to branch into these smaller, more numerous arterioles, right? And then these arterioles are going to branch into even more capillaries than arterioles, and these capillaries are going to be smaller, thinner, and more numerous than the arteries. So let's let's solidify this point using a graph that I made, right? And this is pretty much the relationship, as you can see, between the number of blood vessels and the diameter of each blood vessel. We can see that as we go from arteries to arterioles to capillaries, what happens is the cross-sectional diameter of each blood vessel is going to progressively decrease, and it's going to reach its minimum when we're at the capillaries. The capillaries are the absolute thinnest type of blood vessel. However, these will branch, right? Arteries branch into arterioles, and arterioles branch into capillaries. So what we can see is that the number of these blood vessels is going to increase, right, very dramatically, right? So we're going to have much more capillaries than we are arteries, and these capillaries are going to be much thinner, right, than arteries are. I just want to make that point before we return to this figure. And now that we're at the capillary bed, let's focus on the bottom half of this figure. I apologize for that. And the bottom half of this figure is really focused on returning blood from the capillaries to the heart. Right? So the blood is here now. It exchanges nutrients between the interstitial fluid and exchanges substances between the interstitial fluid. That's great. Now the blood that is left is then going to be transported back to the atrium of the heart, first via what we call a venule, right? And then these venules are going to converge into veins. Now, up here, you notice when we're talking about arteries and arterioles, I say that arteries branch into arterioles, right? And arterioles branch into capillaries. Now I'm saying capillaries converge, right, into venules, and venules converge into veins. And if you're thinking exactly the reverse of what I showed you before, you're absolutely right, right? What's going to happen is we have these capillaries, right? Let's say this is a capillary, for example, and I actually think I drew it too big. You'll see why in a minute. We have tons of these capillaries, right? Right, let's have another capillary right here that's going to converge, right? These are going to converge into this is going to be a venule, right? And then we have even more of those venules, right, that are going to converge, right, into a vein, right? I apologize for my poor drawing here. We'll get rid of all this nonsense in a minute. But we have all these venules converging into a vein, right? So we have capillaries that converge into venules, that converge into veins, right? And this is exactly the reverse of what we saw earlier, right? So before we were speaking about this half of this figure, right? Arteries going into capillaries. And now when we talk about blood returning to the heart, right? What's going to happen is the diameter of these blood vessels is going to increase, right? Capillaries are going to become wider, turn into venules. Venules are become wider, converge into veins. But the number is going to decrease, right? We have lots of capillaries, right, when we started, but as we go closer and closer to the heart, the number of blood vessels declines, and we have much fewer veins than we did capillaries, right, when we're about to enter the heart. So we have this branching and converging relationship that is really important for us to understand, and I'll get to why in a subsequent lecture, but for now it's just important for us to know that these relationships exist. Now let's put all the pieces together, right? This is a very complex diagram, although it's found in many textbooks, illustrating the movement of blood throughout the human body, throughout the human circulatory system. As I pointed out before, blood only flows unidirectionally through a closed circulatory system. So we can see these arrows, right? And we can see that the blood flows only in this direction, right? The direction that I'm currently moving in, right? And so that's one thing that I want to point out. And the second thing I want to point out is that there is a lot of redundancy in this figure. Right? For example, we have two lungs. We have a right lung and we have a left lung. But there's really no need for the figure to include those details because it kind of makes it more confusing to understand. That's just one example, right? So we're going to shy away from this figure for a moment. We're going to come back to it, but first I want to go to a figure that I drew, which is not as beautiful, but is simpler to understand in my opinion. And we're actually going to make this figure even more simpler by going to this one. So I like starting off with simple things, and then we will gradually go back to the more complicated figure to understand those details. But we need to understand the basics first. So let's trace the flow of blood. What's going to happen to blood? Let's start off at the right atrium, right? We have this atrium and ventricle, that's the right side of the heart, and this atrium and ventricle that are part of the left side of the heart. So let's follow the path of blood. Blood is going to be dumped into this right atrium via the vein, right? The blood is then going to go from the atrium to the ventricle, right? Remember, the atrium will receive blood from the capillaries, right? So blood is going to go from the capillaries into the atrium, and the ventricle is going to distribute blood to the capillaries, right? So the ventricle is then going to distribute this blood to these capillaries via an artery, right? Arteries take blood away from the heart. This blood is then going to return to the heart via a vein, right? And it's going to return to the heart at the left atrium. Now that blood is going to go from the atrium to the ventricle. It's then going to go into another capillary system, the systemic capillaries, right? Remember we spoke about what the systemic capillaries were. Pretty much anything in the pulmonary circuit has to do with the lungs, right? And anything in the systemic circuit has to do with all the other organs and cells, obviously, except, okay, I apologize for spelling mistakes, except the lungs, right? So the blood, where were we? The blood is going to go from the left ventricle to the systemic capillaries via this special type of artery, and it's then going to return to the heart at the right atrium via this special type of vein, like we mentioned earlier. Right? Let's get a little more detailed. So blood takes two circuits, right? It goes around twice. First through the pulmonary circuit, then through the systemic circuit. And why does this need to happen? Well, the pulmonary circuit, remember the pulmonary capillaries describe the lungs. So when blood goes to the pulmonary capillaries, what's going to happen is it's going to take up oxygen, right? Oxygen from the air that we breathe in, which will end up in our lungs, and thus is going to be accessible to blood flowing in these pulmonary capillaries. And it's going to get rid of CO2, right? This CO2 is the byproduct, right, of respiration that is present in blood that goes to the pulmonary capillaries. Now we have this blood right here, right? And right here, blood is going to be oxygen rich, right? So this blood is going to return via the pulmonary vein to the atrium, the left atrium. Right? And we can clearly see now that the left atrium of the heart, or the left side of the heart for that matter, is going to contain oxygen-rich blood because it just came from the lungs, right? So this oxygen-rich blood is going to enter the left atrium. It's then going to go into the left ventricle. The left ventricle is then going to distribute this oxygen-rich blood to the entire body except the lungs, right? That's what these systemic capillaries describe, right? The blood is going to go to the rest of the body via this artery, right? Remember, we had an artery up here for the pulmonary circuit. It was called the pulmonary artery. Where do we get that name? Obviously, artery comes from, what we just discussed, and pulmonary comes from the name of the circuit. here, when we talk about the systemic circuit, we're going to have this same artery, but it's not just called an artery, it's called the aorta, right? This is the special name for the systemic artery, right? We don't say systemic arteries in biology, we call them aorta. Now, this is going to be the largest artery in the entire body, right? This is going to be where blood pressure reaches its maximum, and we're going to learn in subsequent lectures that one of the functions of the heart is to pump blood, to pressurize blood before it leaves, right? So the blood that leaves this left ventricle is going to be heavily pressurized and is going to end up in this aorta. That blood will then go via the systemic arteries, right, to the systemic capillaries, where, remember, these capillaries will surround body cells. So body cells will need oxygen, right? So oxygen is going to leave the blood, and these body cells are going to dump CO2 into the blood because it's a metabolic waste product, right, of respiration. So now blood has no oxygen and it has lots of CO2, right? So this is going to be oxygen poor blood, right? And this oxygen poor blood is going to be returned to the right atrium via a vein, right? Now, for the pulmonary circuit, this vein was called the pulmonary vein for obvious reasons, but for the systemic circuit, yet again, we have another special name, and this is going to be the systemic vein, if you will, but the special name for the systemic vein is the vena cava, right? And the vena cava is going to return this oxygen poor blood back to the heart at the right atrium. And we can see that since this blood is oxygen poor, right, the entire right side of the heart, right, is going to contain oxygen poor blood. So we have the left side of the heart that contains oxygen-rich blood, the right side of the heart that contains oxygen-poor blood. Now that wasn't too bad, was it? That is pretty much everything that occurs in the circulatory system for humans. Of course, this, like I said, is a very simple view, so let's make this diagram a little more complicated, and as you can see now I've inserted 2 additional details, right? It actually turns out that blood will go through different systemic circuits, if you will, based on the location of the organs, right? So the organs in the head, neck, and forearms are going to receive their blood supply from a different circuit than the organs in the trunk and the hind limbs. Now, when blood is returned from these organs back to the right atrium, it's going to be returned via a special vein called the superior vena cava, right? And then blood returning from these organs back to the right atrium is going to be returned by a vein called the inferior vena cava. Right? Again, very similar to what we discussed before, except with just this additional detail that there are 2 types of vena cava because there are pretty much 2 different types of systemic circuits. And now we get back to here, right? So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because they most likely will not test whether or not you understand circulation in the context of this diagram for the MCAT. But if you wish, you can pause this video right now and you can pretty much trace out the path of blood. I'm going to do that for you very quickly, right? Blood right here is going to be in the right ventricle. That's where we're going to start. Ventricle is going to distribute blood to the pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary circuit will consist of lungs, right? So we have these lungs right here. The blood is then going to move to the lungs. It's going to receive oxygen, dump CO2. This oxygen-rich blood is going to go back to the heart at the left atrium. Left atrium is then going to dump the blood into the left ventricle. Left ventricle will then dump the blood into the entire systemic circuit, right? via the systemic artery, which is called the aorta. Blood will go to the top of the body, pretty much everything above the waistline and pretty much everything below the waistline via two separate arteries, right? So we have the aorta that then branches out into two different systemic arteries. These arteries will then go into the respective capillary beds where we're going to have oxygen that is removed, right, to supply body cells that are performing active respiration, and CO2 that's going to be dumped into the blood. That's why this blood suddenly changes color from being oxygen rich in red to being oxygen poor in blue. This oxygen poor blood is then going to return via the systemic vein, which is called either the superior vena cava if we're talking about blood coming back from the head and forelimbs, or the inferior vena cava if we're talking about blood coming back from the abdominal organs and hind limbs, right? And these two vena cava will then dump blood into the right atrium, right? And then that blood is then going to go to the right ventricle, where we're going to begin this cycle all over again. So that wraps it up for today. If you like this video, please watch my next video on the fluid dynamics of blood circulation. If you have questions, you can send me an email. If you want to comment on it, please leave a comment below. And if you want to support these additional videos, please feel free to donate money, although it is not required, and people who donate money will not have any more or less access to these videos than people who do not donate money. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.